Well, if you have your Bibles, then I today want us to consider something from the portion I read, Jeremiah chapter 8, and going on to the end of the next chapter also. If you want a particular verse for a text, then the 7th verse will do. But Ebed-Melech, a Cushite, an official in the royal palace, heard that they had put Jeremiah into the cistern. Now, some people in the world are given great prominence. They are well known, they are famous, they maybe have achieved something special, or maybe they hold a powerful office. They're considered to be people of significance. They are the movers and shakers, we say, in this world. Some are remembered for positive reasons. We revere Alexander Fleming for discovering penicillin. We maybe might think of someone like Dr. Bernardo, who took mercy on those children, those street children, and opened homes for them. Others are remembered maybe for reasons that are less positive. We think of Herod and his infanticide, killing the children in Bethlehem. We think of someone like Hitler or Stalin. There are people who are remembered and people who think, well, we think they've influenced the world in some way. They are famous. And in our day, there is a celebrity cult, isn't there, about people who matter. But for everyone who achieves fame, there are millions who are inconspicuous. They're not noticed in the same way. We don't know anything about them. Yet I think, in terms of eternity, some of those inconspicuous people will be more significant than many of our so-called celebrities. And when we turn to the Bible, yes, it's easy to look at the famous people, the ones of significance. Abraham, Moses, David, Peter the Apostle, John, Paul. There are so many great people that we can look at and think, yes, God worked in a wonderful way through them. But again, there are so many people that we really know very little about. We don't know the names of almost any of the 7,000 who did not bow the knee to Baal during the time of Jezebel and Ahab. What about those 5,000 that Jesus fed? We don't know. I mean, we know the disciples were there, but very few others. Do we know even their names? And in the time of Jeremiah, although we hear about the kings, we hear about the prophets and so on, yet there are others who are faithful. And here we come across one of them, Ebed-Melech, the Cushite, or most translations now say Ebed-Melech, the Ethiopian. The land of Cush was basically where Ethiopia is in our day. And so here's a story about someone who really wasn't very important. You know the story. Jeremiah was preaching boldly, and he was preaching that Judah's bound to fall, Jerusalem's bound to fall. It's no use trying to fight. You know, the kings were thinking, well, maybe if we can get Egypt on our side, then they will come and save us. But no, it's no use. Babylon's going to be stronger than Egypt. They were thinking of trying to buy political help or maybe resist and fight and so on. And Jeremiah was saying, no. Look, our sins from the past are so great. You think of what happened during the reign of Manasseh. We think of other other people. And yeah, Babylon's bound to conquer us. So why not give in now and save a lot of trouble? Save people's lives. But people didn't like this message. And so, as we read, some of the officials in Jerusalem took Jeremiah, they cast him into a pit, and there he sank in the mud. But Ebed-Melech saw him. Ebed-Melech knew that Jeremiah was preaching the truth, and so he did what he felt he had to do. He went to save the prophet. God's grace was at work in this man's heart. So what I'd like is to try and think a little bit about Ebed-Melech. And as we think about him, think about God's grace towards each one of us. And the first thing we can say about him was that he was not one of God's chosen people. In the Old Testament, we see God choosing, don't we? God chose Abraham and promised that his descendants would be his special people in the world. He differentiated between Isaac and Ishmael, between Jacob and Esau. He confirmed the covenant that he'd made with Abraham, with Isaac and Jacob, and in Egypt the family became a nation of 12 tribes. And God then called them out of Egypt through Moses. And we read words like this in Deuteronomy. The Lord did not set his affection on you and chose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your ancestors, that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. God did with Israel what he didn't do with any other nation. He made a covenant with Israel, which made them different from all other peoples. And one of the great privileges which the Israelites had was that they had a temple where they had the assurance they could meet God in that temple. They would come, they would sacrifice, and God promised that he would meet with them in that temple. But Ebed-Melech was a Cushite. He was an Ethiopian. Because of that, he wasn't allowed into the temple. He could not go in. You maybe might remember what the Jews did when there was a rumour that Paul had taken a Greek into the temple. There was a riot. These people weren't allowed, the nations weren't allowed into the temple. And on top of that, although this translation says that Ebed-Melech was a Cushite, an official in the royal palace, what the Hebrew says was that he was an eunuch. Now, it's true, eunuch might be just a title for the official, but if he was literally a eunuch, then that was another reason why he couldn't go into the temple, because people with imperfection in their bodies were not allowed into the temple. Imagine the situation. He was among the people of God, but he knew he wasn't one of them. He saw other people going to the temple and coming out with a smile on their faces. Maybe they went in with a burden on their hearts. They felt guilty, they needed forgiveness, and they were going in with a sacrifice, and then they were coming out with that relief and that joy in their faces. But he couldn't do it. He knew Jeremiah was a prophet of the Most High God. That's why he went to the king to save the prophet from the cistern. He was convinced that what Jeremiah was saying was true, but he somehow was on the outside. He didn't fit in. He was in the land of promise, but the promises weren't for him. That's how he felt. Now, we live in an age where there is much atheism around. People don't believe in God, or people believe in different types of God, and so on. And some are convinced that Christianity is not true, and they'll argue about it. But there are others who think, no, this sounds like the truth. They're convinced that, yeah, the gospel must be true. And somehow they feel they don't fit in. It's true for the other people, but it's not real for me. I think it's often true for children who are brought up in Christian homes. They've been taught the truth as they grow up, and yet, yeah, Dad and Mum, they've got something that we haven't. We see other people around us, and they seem to have something, but we don't know it ourselves. If there's someone here like that today, well, continue to listen, because this is for you. Ebed-Melech was not one of the chosen people of God. He didn't fit in. Second, Ebed-Melech was a slave. The meaning of the name Ebed-Melech is the servant of the king. And when we think, well, what was an Ethiopian doing in Jerusalem at a time like this? The only answer we come to is that he must have been there as a slave. Maybe he was born to a family who were slaves, but more likely he was taken from Ethiopia, probably as a child. He was sold as a slave. He was sold into slavery. And so here he was in a foreign land, unable to escape, just as Daniel and his friends were taken to Babylon, and they were slaves and unable to leave there. Now, we know that a life of a slave sometimes could be quite comfortable. You think of Joseph when he was taken to Egypt, and in Potiphar's household, he became really the estate manager, didn't he? It was a relatively comfortable life. Or maybe if you were a slave to the king in the time of Solomon, well, it was a time of great wealth and all sorts of different foods were coming in. It would have been not too bad, maybe, to be a slave in Solomon's household. But this wasn't the time of Solomon. The future of the country was very uncertain. One king came after another, and threats coming from all over the place. From Assyria, first of all, and now from Babylon. There were times of great drought. There were times of hunger and famine. There were times when the enemy were at the gates. The armies of the enemy were surrounding Jerusalem. And the kings were just getting worse one after another. You had Josiah, who'd been the king, and he tried to turn things around, but after him came Jehoiakim, and he was a terrible king. He did what Manasseh did. He built altars to false gods. He sacrificed children to the false gods, and so on. And even now, you had Zedekiah, who was really a bit of a wet blanket. He just would not stand up for the truth. The officers came to him and complaining about Jeremiah and said, okay, you do what you want to him. I'm not going to interfere. He sort of knew Jeremiah was telling the truth, and he calls Jeremiah to him secretly and asks him, what's going to happen? And Jeremiah tells him what to do. But then he says, well, don't tell anybody what you told me. And when Jeremiah went, then the king didn't do what Jeremiah told him to do. And the Babylonians, they were a cruel people. They were a cruel people. When you hear some of the things they did, well, it's very similar to Ukrainians hearing what some of the Russians have done in some of the villages they invaded this year. And Ebed-Melech was a slave caught in this situation, with a king who was doing nothing but bringing judgment on the city. Jeremiah was prophesying disaster, and he was caught in it. He was caught in the middle. He was doing what he could do, and so when he saw Jeremiah in trouble, then he went to try and save him. If the prophet died like this, well, all hope would be gone, he thought. And yet he was still caught in this situation. He was a slave, unable to escape, and his future seemed to be nothing but judgment under Babylon. Some people, some people know that God is calling them, but there's something holding them back. They're captive to something. Do you remember that rich young ruler coming to speak to Jesus? And he asked, what must I do to be saved? And Jesus told him, but there was one thing in his life, we will think maybe a little bit about this this evening, one thing in his life which had a hold on him. He was a rich young ruler. And he thought, if I give all my riches away, then how can I live? It's part of the reason I'm here is to make more money, to build up my portfolio. Maybe there's someone here who says, yeah, something's holding me back. I remember someone who was at university, the time I was at university, and he was being interviewed. He became a bit of a celebrity, and he was being interviewed on Welsh radio. About his time, about his whole life, really. It was a sort of Welsh version of Desert Island Discs. And May Jones was being interviewed. And he was talking about his time at university. And he was in the theological college, and he had nothing good to say about the theological college. And he was talking about how really people just didn't seem to have anything worth giving to him. And the interviewer asked him, well, was there anybody that you respected there? Oh yes, I respected the evangelicals. And he talked so highly about the evangelicals that Betty George asked him in the end, well, you talk so highly about them, why didn't you join them? Oh, it cost too much. Costing there, not in terms of money, but in terms of he enjoyed the high life, he enjoyed the fame that he was getting for his gifting and so on. Is anything holding you back? Or maybe there's a sin that's got hold of you. A sin that you don't seem to be able to conquer. And when that gets hold of your will, then you're convinced, well, God can't accept somebody like me, because I keep on falling into the same thing. I decide one day that that's enough. I'm never going to do this again. And maybe you succeed for a few weeks or even a few months, and then it grabs you again. And you think, I'm too hopeless a case. Maybe Christ has room for other people, but he doesn't have room for me. And you know, it's amazing how people can then comfort themselves and saying, well, maybe it's not at all true. Maybe I'm okay. You know, you can laugh at somebody who stands on the street with a great big sign saying, repent, for the end of the world is nigh. But don't you realize, unless you turn, unless you trust, unless you put your faith in Jesus, then the end of the world is nigh in one sense for all of us, because we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I heard this last week about one of my school friends who died. And we're all going to die, aren't we? I remember, you see, Tim Keller being interviewed, and somebody asked him, do you really believe that hell is a place of eternal fire and so on? And Tim Keller's response was, well, no, I don't. It's much worse than that. And he used the example of, we all know some people who complain all the time. And you think of that complaint becoming one long, unending cry of complaint and being shut in that. That's hell. Or we have a neighbour who's suffering from dementia, and it's very sad to see, and she comes sometimes to tell us, oh, I don't remember, I'm so lonely. She has no close relatives, and she's there on her own, and I'm so lonely. And you just imagine that loneliness becoming utter loneliness. No neighbour even to go and speak to them. Utter darkness. And the worst thing about it is that those in utter darkness know that it's their fault that they're there. They'll realise that they have chosen that path, turning against the light that was given to them. Yeah, Jerusalem was facing a terrible future when you hear what happened to Jerusalem. And Ebed-Melech was caught in this as a slave. And maybe you feel you're caught as a slave in your unbelief at the moment. But Ebed-Melech received the grace of God. When we read on, Jeremiah was lifted from the pit, but he had to remain in sort of captivity in the courtyard of the guard. And then we turn to the end of the next chapter. And what do we read? Chapter 39, verse 15. While Jeremiah had been confined in the courtyard of the guard, the word of the Lord came to him. Go and tell Ebed-Melech the Cushite, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. I'm about to fulfill my words against this city, words concerning disaster, not prosperity. At that time they will be fulfilled before your eyes, but I will rescue you on that day, declares the Lord. You will not be given into the hands of those you fear. I will save you. You will not fall by the sword, but will escape with your life because you trust in me, declares the Lord. If judgment was going to fall on Judah and on Jerusalem, judgment was not going to fall on Ebed-Melech. He was going to be saved. This is the one who didn't fit in. This was the one who was just a slave. This is the one who wasn't given access to go into the temple to seek the grace of God. And if Babylon was going to destroy the walls of Jerusalem, God was going to be a wall around Ebed-Melech to protect him. God was going to rescue him. You will not be given into the hands of those you fear. They all feared the Babylonians. They heard what they were doing. You know, the high priest, the priests were taken from Jerusalem and they were whipped to death. Horrible things were happening. But you will not be given into the hands of those you fear. You will not fall by the sword, but will escape with your life. He would be free. A slave was captive as long as his master was still there. But his master, the king, was going to be taken. There would be no king in Jerusalem, and he would be free. He could, if he wanted to, go back to Ethiopia. He could, if we wanted to, leave. He would be free. He would not be a slave anymore. Why was this happening? You will not fall by the sword, but will escape with your life, because you trust in me. Because you believe the word of Jeremiah. Because you believe that I am a God who keeps his promises. Because you believe that I am a God who can be merciful. This was someone who took God at his word. As Jeremiah preached, he listened and he believed. And this is the wonder of the gospel we preach. God said through his Son, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." He didn't say to the thief on the cross, "Well, sorry, you don't fit, you're shut out." No, he said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." What about my sin that I'm a slave to? Jesus has taken that sin to the cross. He's paid the penalty that you deserve. You deserve to be separated from God, but Jesus himself said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus was separated from his Father, couldn't find his Father. Jesus endured that utter darkness so that we never have to endure that darkness ourselves. Now, maybe all you have heard this before, time and time again. But, you know, as a Christian, I'm always encouraged when I'm reminded of this. If you're a Christian today who feels that you're unworthy, yes, you're unworthy, but he died for you. Trust in him. If you're unsure you have any relationship with God, if you think you don't fit and that you're on the outside, Jesus came for people like you to come and receive his forgiveness. There's a quote from a sermon that John Bunyan gave. It's quoted in Gentle and Lowly, a book by Dane Ortland that many have found helpful. And in this sermon, John Bunyan is preaching about him that cometh to me I will in no wise cast out. This is what he says. But I'm a great sinner, say you. I will in no wise cast out, says Christ. But I am an old sinner, say you. I will in no wise cast out, says Christ. But I'm a hard-hearted sinner, say you. I will in no wise cast out, says Christ. But I'm a backsliding sinner, say you. I will in no wise cast out, says Christ. But I have served Satan all my days, say you. I will in no wise cast out, says Christ. But I've sinned against light, say you. I will in no wise cast out, says Christ. But I have sinned against mercy, say you. I will in no wise cast out, says Christ. But I have no good thing to bring with me, say you. I will in no wise cast out, says Christ. This promise was provided to answer all objections and does answer them. Look to some of the hymns. What do the hymns say? Come, ye souls by sin afflicted, bowed with fruitless sorrow down, by the broken law convicted, through the cross, behold the crown. Look to Jesus, mercy flows through him alone. He died and was resurrected, and now bears a crown that says you can receive mercy if you trust in him. Sweet as home to pilgrims weary, light to newly opened eyes. Have your eyes suddenly been opened? Flowing springs in deserts dreary is the rest the cross supplies. All who taste it shall to bliss immortals rise. If you're unsure, go somewhere quiet. Speak to God. If you want, come and speak to someone else and ask for help. And just tell him you have nothing to bring, but you're trusting his word in Jesus. And you know he will in no wise cast you out.